are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and the practices of great military leaders, all by way of distilling from them lessons that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So today I'm going to be talking about one of the arguably most controversial members of the military in the 20th century. In the end, he has become widely known as the father of military aviation, but in his day, he managed to get himself court-martialed, even though he was a brevet flag officer. And that is William Mitchell, better known as Billy Mitchell. And my impetus for talking about Billy Mitchell is a book I read about him that's quite good. It's called Billy Mitchell, Crusader for Air Power by Alfred Hurley. This is a wonderful book. It's not particularly long, about 150 some odd, 150 pages basically, and it gives a wonderful summation of Billy Mitchell's life and what he sought to accomplish by the way of developing military air power for the United States of America. So I think that Mitchell really gives us an archetype on how to deal with a situation where our superiors, or if you have your own business, our clients, don't agree with something that we think needs to happen or not happen. And we can learn from that because I don't know about you, but I've been in circumstances where my clients wanted to do something, and me here on the front lines, whether it was when I had my real estate services company back from the mid 80s to the mid 2000s, or now in my professional fiduciary practice, a client or somebody connected with an assignment wants to do something that clearly is not in the best interests of the project and may not even be in their own best interest, although they perceive that it is. And here I am on the front lines, right, where presumably I have the most and the best knowledge of what's going on. And yet, for me to pull rank, if you will, which in some cases I can do because of the legal authority that I hold as a court-appointed administrator, doesn't always make for the best client relations, and down the road might cause as many problems as it solves, in the moment. And so this is really the example that we can take from Billy Mitchell. Now, I think it's reasonable to say that most of us did not or will not grow up the way Billy Mitchell did. So I am going to take some time to talk about his background so we can understand that. But I think it would also be reasonable to say that Billy Mitchell grew up in pretty rarefied circumstances, and while many of us view that as, well, he didn't have much to lose, I would say to the contrary. Maybe he had more to lose than most of us, because his father, for example, was a U.S. senator, they had position in society, and it's That's not an easy thing to sacrifice. The pressures on an individual to maintain his position in society are great. And what one loses when one loses one's position in society is not a trivial matter. So I invite you to maybe flip the way these things are usually looked at on their heads, and perhaps better look at the sacrifices that Billy Mitchell made through his eyes, rather than through the eyes of this may sound harsh, but through the eyes of jealousy, perhaps, or a sense of, well, he was a wealthy, privileged guy, so he got what he deserved. So Mitchell was born on December 29th, 1879 in Nice, France. Though he was born to Americans, so he was an American, even though he was born in France. His family was wealthy and politically well connected. As I mentioned, his father, John Mitchell, was a U.S. Senator from Wisconsin. His grandfather, Alexander Mitchell, was a railroad magnate, and he made a ton of money building railroads, and one of the richest men in the Midwest. So it was really coming out of this atmosphere, if you will, of affluence, of political connection, of social standing, and education, that Billy Mitchell was raised. So he grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which, notwithstanding his family's wealth and prominence, was a typical Midwestern city. So he didn't grow up in New York, in that kind of society. He grew up in Midwestern society. He later enrolled in the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., but he left college at age 18 to enlist in the U.S. Army during the Spanish-American War that began in 1898. So I think we can already see that one could imagine his parents were not particularly happy about this. Why are you not getting your education, and why are you joining the war? You don't need to do that. But Mitchell was striking out on the course of a life that he wanted to live. So really, his military career was marked by rapid advancement and avocation for air power, and the growth of innovation in air power, the importance of air power in the military, and as well as being marked by controversy. So in the Spanish-American War, and his early Army career, a period from about 1898 through 1916. So he was commissioned first as a second lieutenant in the Signal Corps, where he worked on military communications. Now, in the very, very nascent period of military aviation, planes were part of the Signal Corps. So they were soon after spun off into the Army Air Service. That was the original name for the air power branch of the Army, for so to speak. It later became the Army Air Corps, and then the Army Air Forces, until finally post-World War II, the Air Force was split off as a separate branch of the military. So he served in the Philippines, which was a pretty common thing for officers of this period. The Philippines was still an American protectorate, basically. And so part of your career rotations meant going to the Philippines. He rose through the ranks there, gaining experience in logistics and strategy. In 1916, at the age of 36, he became the youngest officer to serve on the general staff. So he very early on showed leadership promise. Now, one could imagine that behind the scenes, his family was pulling from some strings for him. That may very well have been the case. But the U.S. Army in this time period was a much more meritocratic institution than I think it's oftentimes given credit for. And the proof of that is that when the U.S. Army, or the American Expeditionary Force landed in Europe in 1917 to enter World War I, there wasn't the huge turnover in leadership that we saw when the United States first entered World War II. So the infiltration of politics into the army was not nearly as deep in the very early part of the 20th century as it became on in through the 1930s and in the lead up to World War II. So it's in World War I, which the United States actually was only involved in World War I from approximately April-May 1917 to November 1918, when the war ended. The 11th month, November, of the 11th day of November 1918, at the 11th hour, was the armistice. So Mitchell was sent to Europe to study aviation. At the time, France, Britain, and even Germany were far ahead of the United States in terms of the military use of aviation. So he became chief of the air service of the American Expeditionary Force. So a very senior position for, a young man who was 37, 38 years old at the time. He worked closely with the French and British Air Forces, and he learned advanced aerial combat strategies, and really was able to delve deeply into the issues surrounding the development of military aviation. He planned and commanded the largest Allied air operation in World War I during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, using over 1,400 aircraft in a coordinated attack. Now, even today, to coordinate that number of aircraft is an enormous undertaking with all of the advanced communication systems that we have. Go back more than 100 years and think about the limits of communication. Aircraft did not have radios in them. So this is really an astonishing feat for such a relatively young man. He earned both the Distinguished Service Cross and the Distinguished Service Medal for his leadership. Now, and again, I need to point out that at this point in U.S. military history, like I said, over 100 years ago, medals were not given out like gold stars for attendance the way they are in today's military. There was no such thing as an end of tour award, which is routinely awarded to officers and more senior enlisted people every time they finish a tour of duty. I know I have 1, 2, 3, 4. I think I have 4 or 5 of them, right, out of the decorations, personal decorations that I received during my military career. I think one of them was truly earned, the one I got in Okinawa, Japan. The others I was given, in one case, despite my telling the powers that be that I didn't want an end of tour award, that I felt that they were essentially immoral. I did my duty. I think I did my duty well, but I didn't do anything extraordinary. Now, I will be the first one to admit I think mine is a minority opinion among people in the military. And officers dearly love to give medals. Commanding officers dearly love to give medals. Nonetheless, to receive the Distinguished Service Cross and the Distinguished Service Medal both is a pretty extraordinary achievement, even in wartime. Okay, so post World War One, from the period from about 1919 through 1925, this was really the I don't want to say the beginning, but it was the enlargement of Mitchell's advocacy for air power. He returned to the United States as deputy chief of the Air Service, and even then started advocating for an independent Air Force. So we're talking almost 25 years, pardon me, before an independent Air Force came into being. Mitchell was already advocating for that. So, and as he became an ever louder advocate for air power, he began clashing with Army and Navy leadership, who were in many cases dead set against his calls for increased investment in air power. So the Navy, for example, was experimenting with aircraft carriers at this time and with naval aviation, but the Navy really believed in their battleships, and continued to do so even as naval aviation developed. And it was really the advent of World War II where it just became impossible to ignore that battleships were no longer the important platform in the Navy. I'm sorry, I don't want to say not important. They were no longer the primary platform in the Navy. That aircraft carriers had surpassed them in their importance in executing naval strategy, operations, and tactics. And the Army was going through its own transitions, not just with air power, but the tank, which had been introduced into combat in World War One, was recognized by many innovators, including George Patton, as who, by the way, dearly loved the horse mounted cavalry, but who saw the writing on the walls and realized that the Army had to transition out of horse cavalry to tanks. So all of these things were going on, but there was an ossification among senior military leadership and civilian military leadership that was resistant to these big changes. And by the way, it may very well be the case that we're going through that today. So there are many people who are advocating for getting rid of, or at least de-emphasizing, aircraft carriers, but on the part of the Navy, because of the rise of drones and the lethality of drones, especially drone swarms that people think could easily overcome an aircraft carrier. And now you've taken the investment of what amounts to several $billion once the carrier is fitted out and has the air wing on board, concentrated it on this one platform, and you send a bunch of relatively inexpensive drones to overwhelm the aircraft carrier, and it ends up on the bottom of the ocean. I haven't studied that particular issue a whole lot. I can certainly hear the argument. On the other hand, the ability to project power the way an aircraft carrier can, I'm not sure that its usefulness is over to the extent that we don't need them anymore. But like I said, we could very well be at another major technological inflection point, as we were back in the basically early 1920s, when Billy Mitchell was at really was stepping up his advocacy for air power. Now, he conducted several tests, bombing tests, in his promotion of military aviation. One of the things that he did was he proved that aircraft could sink battleships, and he did that by showing that airplanes could destroy the captured German ship, the SMS Ostfriesland. which really shocked naval leadership, and we really see that. I'm going to talk about some of these other ones, some of the other things, some of the other demonstrations he did, but you can see that Mitchell clearly had a point, despite his detractors, not wanting to hear it. He published books, he published articles, issuing warnings about the future of aerial warfare and the vulnerability of the United States if it didn't create an independent air force. Both Great Britain and France pretty early on had independent air forces. The British, of course, had the Royal Air Force, the RAF. I think it was originally the Royal Air Service and then became the Royal Air Force. And I'm going up on the name of France's Air Force, but I think it was called l'Armée d'Air de France, which is essentially, the air army of France. And he also, interestingly enough, predicted that Japan would attack Pearl Harbor, in an aerial attack, of course, but military leadership dismissed his warnings. So Mitchell got so frustrated with what he perceived as the inability of military leadership to see his points and act on them, that he publicly criticized Army and Navy leaders after a series of military of aviation disasters, calling them, quote, criminally negligent, unquote. And as a result of this, in 1925, he was court-martialed for insubordination. He was convicted and he was suspended from duty for 5 years. Now, it's interesting to note that General Mitchell's rank as a general was a theater rank, what's sometimes called a brevet rank, that he got for his work in theater in Europe in World War I. At the time of his trial, he had reverted back to his rank as a colonel. So it was a colonel who was court-martialed. Nonetheless, because of his standing and such, people regarded him, and sort of the average person, regarded him at the level of a general officer. So after his court-martial, Mitchell basically, after his conviction at the court-martial, Mitchell decided to resign from the Army in 1926, and that effectively ended his military career. However, it did not stop his advocacy of air power, which continued for another 10 years until 1936. So he continued to write books, he continued to write articles, he gave public speeches, he testified before Congress about the importance of air superiority. Again, he continued his predictions about the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor. And interestingly enough, although he didn't get much traction while he was alive, many of his ideas came to fruition and were validated during World War II and thereafter, including the establishment of an independent Air Force in, I believe it was 1947, with the passage of the U.S. Defense Act that created the Department of Defense and then made each of the service branches, the Army, the Navy, Marine Corps, and then the Air Force, as sort of sub-departments of the Department of Defense. So as a note, by the way, on his private life, so he retired to his farm in Virginia. He lived there relatively quietly with his family. His health declined due to heart disease and complications from the stresses of his battles with the military leadership. And on February 19th, 1936, at the age of only 56, Billy Mitchell died. So he died a relatively young man, and I think it would be reasonable to conclude that a somewhat broken man. That in the end, this institution that he left college to join at 18 years old, because he felt so strongly that he wanted to serve his country, in the end had not only rejected him but had censured him in its almost its harshest way, a guilty verdict at a court martial, and had tossed him aside, all because he was perhaps especially by the standards of today, unguarded in his criticism of military leadership. It is interesting to note. Now, of course, if you've heard me talk about this kind of issue before, we can only hold people responsible for their actions in their own time. And so I don't mean this as a criticism of the court-martial board that found Mitchell guilty, but I wonder if today Mitchell's behavior, would have been grounds for a court-martial, let alone a guilty verdict. The demands of respect and propriety 100 plus years ago in the military, far greater than what they are today. And by the way, I'm not saying that one is better than the other. I think strong cases can be made for a strict sense of discipline and a strict accordance of respect to military leadership, especially among subordinates and the rank and file. On the other hand, there is a need for people to speak freely in the military from the most junior on up, in order to have the most effective military. And one could well imagine that even in those times, even in 1925, what the senior leadership of the Army was most upset about was that Mitchell made these remarks essentially in public. He went public with his criticisms in a way that they felt, reflected badly on the Army and the sense of discipline it was supposed to maintain. So I think, to a large extent, Mitchell has been vindicated, at least in terms of his ideas, perhaps a little less so in terms of his behavior. So posthumously, like I said, his World War II vindicated a lot of what Billy Mitchell was advocating for. In 1946, 10 years after his death, he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his contributions to military aviation. Of course, it was awarded posthumously, but nonetheless, he was recognized and remains widely recognized as the father of the United States Air Force, which, as I mentioned a little while ago, became an independent branch of the military in 1947. So he paid a huge price for sticking to his guns, so to speak. And there are I distilled 6 lessons, I think, that we can learn from Billy Mitchell and his fight against the entrenched powers during his career. So, and by the way, they all come from reading this book, Crusader for Air Power. So I'll put a link. Of course, it'll be an affiliate link to the book in the show notes after the show posts on YouTube. But I do encourage you to read this book. It's a wonderful book, and Billy Mitchell is in many ways an amazing person about whom to read. So, first of all, number one lesson when we go up against our superiors who disagree with us. Number one, we have to know our facts and build a strong case. So that we feel a certain way about something, or we have a strong conviction. Not enough in any way, shape, or form. If we feel strongly enough about it, we need to make the effort to become the subject matter expert. That's just the bottom line. And there were few, if any, people probably in the world who knew more about air power from a military's perspective than Billy Mitchell, in the same way that there were few people in the world who knew more about tanks and tank warfare than George Patton. And by the way, he may very well have been the top swordsman. Well, he was the top swordsman, certainly in the United States, and among the top swordsmen in the world during his lifetime. So both men took the time to go beyond mastering the topics for which they advocated. Okay, so in the end, we need to gather irrefutable evidence and present it in a strategic, measured way, building our case and seeking out the arguments as to why we're wrong, dissecting those arguments, and through additional information or additional logical argument, show that the criticisms of our position are incorrect, and indeed our case is the strongest case. So that's really number one, and that is, I think, the foundation. Anytime we're going to take on an issue with which our superiors disagree. I would add, by the way, that how we present the case in many cases is as important as the case itself. It doesn't do to make our seniors look foolish, to put them down, to talk to them disrespectfully. None of the, if we have truly mastered the facts and the arguments in our favor, we don't need to be condescending or disrespectful in presenting it. We can present it with humility and make our case all the stronger. Next, and this is something that I think Mitchell used to good advantage, is to use demonstrations to prove our point. Now, when I say demonstrations, I don't mean marching in the streets. I am unconvinced that marching in the streets to raise awareness does anything but irritate most people, frankly. So what I mean is, and to use Mitchell as the example, so he organized bombing tests and successfully sank battleships, proving air power's effectiveness. So I mentioned the 1921 bombing test of the SMS Ostfriedland. Mitchell's first provisional air brigade was assigned to bomb this particular ship, as well as derelict U.S. Navy warships off the coast of Virginia, and they were quite successful. So first of all, they hit a stationary target, the Ostfriedland. They used a Martin MB-2 bombers. They dropped a series of bombs, culminating in a 2,000-pound bomb, and sank the ship in 21 minutes. Okay, the Navy was shocked because they just did not think that aircraft could sink a battleship. And then they went on to Mitchell went on to show that not only could aircraft sink a ship that was not moving, it could also sink ships that were underway. So they targeted U.S. Navy battleships, the New Jersey and the Virginia, off of Chesapeake Bay. The ships were underway and making evasive maneuvers, simulating actual combat. Nonetheless, Mitchell's aircraft successfully sank both ships using large bombs. So when we use real world demonstrations to make our point, it adds a sort of undeniability to that for which we are advocating. Okay, so look, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. A demonstration that vividly shows the point we want to make is also worth is probably worth 10,000 or 100,000 words, right? The sinking of those battleships by the First Provisional Air Brigade, again, it shocked the Navy. It also, in some ways, shocked the Army because they didn't realize. I mean, and it is interesting. You would have thought, on some level, the Army would have said, "Hey, this gives us an advantage over the Navy to get greater funding, et cetera, et cetera." But and there. My next point is going to show there were a number of people, and even highly placed people, who were supporters, if not actual allies, of Mitchell. But the tide, he never caught the tide in terms of the senior leadership that could make the decisions back in the 1920s. So the third thing is find allies and build support. And it's tempting in these days of social media to like get a big social media following and all that kind of stuff. I mean, depending on what your issue is, that may be useful. But in many cases, allies mean individuals placed strategically to put in the good word for us, to open doors for us, to help us persuade people who are key to making the decision for which we're advocating. These are the kind of people among whom we need to build support. So in the military itself, among Mitchell's supporters were Brigadier General William Billy Gilmore, with whom he worked at the Air Service, Colonel Henry Hap Arnold, who later became the commanding general of the U.S. Army Air Forces in World War II, okay, and was influenced by Mitchell's ideas. Major Carl Spaatz, who was a future commander of the U.S. Air Force, and he learned about Mitchell's ideas and theories and applied them in World War II. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, who was the World War I flying ace, strongly agreed with Mitchell's perspective on air power and was in some ways proof of it. And also Rear Admiral William A. Moffett, who, although he was a naval officer, really, was a supporter of Mitchell as someone who in general was advocating for air power, as Moffett was doing specifically in the Navy for carrier-based air power. Outside of the military, Mitchell also had his supporters, including Fiorello LaGuardia, who, if you're from New York, you probably recognize his name. He was the future mayor of New York, and he was a strong supporter of military aviation in Congress. At the time, he was a congressman. Senator Hiram Bingham, who defended Mitchell during the time he was being court-martialed and advocated for air power in the United States Senate, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, at the time Assistant Secretary of the Navy, right? And so he wasn't a direct supporter, but FDR recognized the potential for aviation, and he helped expand naval aviation in particular during his time as an Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And so again, the lesson here is to cultivate strategic relationships, influence with decision makers. Oftentimes, having a few influential people on your side can make a big difference. You don't necessarily have to have the masses on your side. It's really a matter of understanding who is going to make the decision about this issue for which I'm advocating, and what are their perspectives, and who might I be able to ally with, and who might I be able to change their mind, and so will either support me or at least won't go against me in what I'm trying to accomplish. Okay, number 4, be strategic in challenging authority. So, as I've noted, Mitchell was direct. He was confrontational, and that in the end is really what led to his court martial. And that's, I think that's not necessary. We do live in a confrontational society, and so sometimes it may be necessary, but within the company for which you work or the professional practice where your superiors have the ability to largely fire you at will, it may not be the best strategy to publicly confront them in the halls of power, within the organization, deal with them in that context. And as I noted before, if we have the knowledge, if we have the superior arguments, especially arguments that are tempered by listening to the arguments against us and reformulating to counter those, we can approach all of this with a sense of humility and avoid the fate of Billy Mitchell. So timing, tone, all of these things matter. There isn't a lot of point to antagonizing people unnecessarily. I get it. Sometimes it's too tempting, but we may be shooting our, what is the word? Shooting ourselves in the foot. And we need to keep our eye on the goal. Next, and this is sort of related to point number 3, and that is public opinion. It can be a powerful tool. It depends on the issue. Okay, and it may be worth building and therefore going public. Now, in the matter of something concerning the government, the military, right? The government, the military, these work for us as citizens. So while it may work better to go behind the scenes, not necessarily. So our fellow citizens, I would argue with respect to the military, our fellow citizens should understand these issues as much as they care to, and should weigh in on them and be encouraged to weigh in on them. I'm not one who believes that only people who have been in the military should be weighing in on military issues. The defense of our country is far too important to have only military and former military people involved in the debate. And so this is something that Mitchell did quite well with his books, his articles, his lectures, speaking tours, etc. He really engaged the public as much as possible in understanding that for which he was advocating, and hopefully getting behind him. Now, in today's world, we would do that primarily through social media, I think. But nonetheless, the idea that we want to get public opinion behind us, especially in a matter relating to governance and defense, certainly makes sense. Now, for a private company, getting public opinion behind us may be a more difficult call, because it means exposing the senior leadership of the company to potentially to ridicule. Now, by the way, it happens all the time. When we see this. This is when Congress calls the leaders of private companies to testify, and they berate them and they put them down, et cetera, try to make them look foolish. It's all kind of, frankly, from my perspective, theater. I don't see the point in doing that. But congressmen and senators, I think, seem to think that especially for their most ardent supporters, they like that kind of thing. I'm not sure that it really advances anybody's argument or leads to better outcomes. And in fact, I think I could make a reasonably good case that it's counterproductive, because by creating these shows and berating these people, it locks people into their positions, and creates, bad guys, turns them evil, all of this kind of stuff, when in fact most of these people are regular people like you and me. They may run organizations that have billions of dollars in sales and such, but in the end, they have their objectives, and we are probably better off just getting out of their way and letting them do their things within the confines of the law. So, in addition to working on public opinion on his own, Mitchell did have journalists and public supporters. He had the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune were supporters of his ideas and helped build public awareness. And a lot of younger officers and aviation pioneers saw Mitchell as a visionary as well, you might imagine. And it shouldn't be too surprising that younger military people who were looking to what is the next war going to be about were more forward-looking than their superiors, than their more senior colleagues. Now, many of the junior officers could not, or felt they could not publicly support him, especially after his court-martial, because they feared damaging their own careers. However, as you saw in the list of military people, among them Hap Arnold and Carl Spaatz, they did benefit from essentially supporting and following Mitchell's ideas, because they put them into action in World War II. And then finally, and this is perhaps I don't want to say the most important lesson, but I think this is where the rubber meets the road, as we say. If we're going to advocate for something that our superiors don't want, we have to accept that comes with risk. It does, because in the end, if they have the power to fire us, they may. Okay, that's just the bottom line. And Mitchell is the prime example of this. In the end, despite his dedication to the military, to the Army, he was court-martialed, convicted, and while he wasn't directly, or wasn't permanently kicked out, by essentially saying he couldn't serve for 5 years, they were essentially telling him, we don't want you around anymore. And I think that was the Army's way of getting rid of Mitchell without having to suffer the consequences of kicking him out altogether. And it's interesting to note that as well connected, as wealthy, and as influential as Billy Mitchell was, in the end, he paid a big price for sticking to his guns and continuing to do what he thought was right. So, this circles back to the point I made at the beginning of the show. We tend to think of people in wealthy and privileged positions as not having much to lose, etc. I don't agree with that. Oftentimes they have a lot to lose. And I think that Billy Mitchell's death at 56 shows the toll that this took on him, that his fight took on him, and he paid a tremendous price. No, he didn't become poor, as some people do, when they're advocating something against powerful opposition. So he was fortunate in that. But all his wealth couldn't extend his life, and in the end, it couldn't keep him in the military, and it didn't allow him to advance into permanent general rank or anything like that. So I think if we're going to advocate for something that is unpopular and that our superiors disagree with, we have to, first of all, have a conversation with ourselves along the lines of self. Are you really ready to sacrifice in order to advocate for this? So, and again, I don't know that that's the most important lesson, but I think that is a good note on which to wrap up this show, is our own belief and willingness to commit to that which for which we advocate is central to going up against powerful people who disagree with us. And we need to be committed if we're going to do that. This is not for the faint of heart. So real quickly, the 6 things we can learn from Billy Mitchell in terms of going up against our superiors when they disagree with us. First of all, know your facts, build a strong case. Second, use demonstrations, vivid examples to prove your point. Find allies, build support for that for which you're advocating. Be strategic in challenging authority. A frontal attack oftentimes is not the best way to go. Next, if appropriate, get public opinion behind you. Work with reporters, journalists. In our day, work with social media. And finally, accept that advocacy comes with risks. Okay? And will you be successful? Well, you might, and you might not, or you may not be during your own lifetime, but the future may vindicate you as it did with Billy Mitchell. And that's, I think, also part of the commitment, is knowing that merely because you didn't see the change or as much of the change as you wanted during your lifetime, that doesn't matter. That doesn't mean, that doesn't mean that you aren't over time going to have a bigger influence on society or on the institutions or on the business in which you're involved. So that's my message to you. Hope you found it both interesting and intellectually stimulating, give you food for thought. So much of what I do, especially in this show, is to give you food for thought and challenge your ideas about how you may handle things so that you can perhaps deal with them in a better way. So I thank you very much for joining me, especially my live viewers. Always great to know you're there checking out the show. If you have any thoughts, criticisms, questions, please feel free to post them on social media. Always glad to hear them, and look forward to that. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time, normally would be my show, People Making Money. Tomorrow is Abraham Lincoln's birthday, and which is celebrated on February 12th. And so I'm doing a special edition of the Way to Wow shows, as is my practice when we have one of these occasions. And I'm going to talk about Abraham Lincoln's life, especially his early life, what formed him into the man he became. And then I'm going to read his second inaugural address. For those of you who know Abraham Lincoln, you're probably thinking, wait, why not the Gettysburg Address? Yes, the Gettysburg Address is powerful, but I think for the times that we're in right now, the second inaugural address is more appropriate. And then on Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time is my show, Jiggers' Place. It's getting toward the end of the week then. We sit back, have a cocktail, and we're going to talk about relationships. I've been offering this question for the last few shows. What do you think is the most important thing in a relationship? And I'm guessing you have an idea in mind, and I'm betting you that when you watch the show, you're going to find out it's actually something else. So please join me Thursday, 5 p.m. Pacific time at Jiggers' Place. And then next week, 10 a.m. Pacific time on Monday is my show, Trust and Estates Weekly. Actually, I take that back. We're going to have another special edition because it's George Washington's birthday. So on Monday at 10 a.m., we'll have a special edition. And then we'll be back 7 days from today for the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. So I thank you so much for joining me. I deeply appreciate it. If you're not a subscriber, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. If you are a subscriber and you know someone, a friend or a family member who you think might benefit from the show, please pass the show along to them, and maybe they'll choose to be a subscriber as well. So again, would deeply appreciate that. And so it's time to sign off, as I always do, by saying, Marie, darling, you are my bell. Courage at all.